A mission so dangerous, so deeply buried, that Hitler himself gave one final order, before the walls came closing in. Destroy it, all of it. Not the enemy, not the battlefield, but his own secret. The files were burned, the men were silenced, and the world was never supposed to know. But someone kept a fragment, just one, and that single piece of paper changed everything we thought we knew. What was Hitler so afraid of? What was so powerful, so explosive, that even he couldn't let it survive? The answer has been hiding in the shadows for over 80 years. Until now. Welcome to World War II Mystery Story, the channel where history's darkest secrets finally gets to speak. Now, before we go any further, if you are someone who has lived long enough to know that the most important stories are always the ones they tried to hide, then this channel was made for you. So if you are above 50, wise and curious, do an old friend a small favor. Press that subscribe button. Think of it like saving a seat at the table before the story begins. You wouldn't want to miss the next chapter, would you? And while you're settling in, drop a comment below and tell us where in the world are you watching from tonight. Whether it's London, Lahore, New York, or a quiet little town nobody's ever heard of, we want to know. This mystery belongs to all of us. In the final, desperate months of World War II, something unusual happened inside the crumbling heart of the Third Reich. It was not a battle. It was not a retreat. It was an erasure. Deep inside the collapsing command structure of Nazi Germany, orders were quietly passed through channels that officially did not exist. These were not military orders. They were not signed in the usual way. They carried no stamps, no formal letterheads, no traceable signatures. They were whispered orders, ghost orders, and they pointed to one singular mission, a mission so carefully hidden that even senior Nazi generals had never heard its name. Historians who later studied the Reich's final days noticed something deeply strange. Among the mountains of documents recovered from burned-out bunkers, captured offices, and hastily abandoned military posts, there were gaps. Clean, deliberate gaps. Not the gaps of chaos or war damage. These were surgical gaps. Specific files. Specific names. Specific dates. All carefully removed, as if someone had gone through history itself, with a pair of scissors. One Allied intelligence officer, reviewing captured Abwehr records in the summer of 1945, reportedly stopped at one particular empty folder and said to his colleague, "Someone didn't just hide this. They wanted it to never have existed at all." That folder was traced back to a direct order from Hitler's inner circle, issued sometime between late 1944 and the final weeks of April 1945. But here is what made it different from all the other destruction orders of that period. Most wartime leaders, when facing defeat, destroy evidence of their crimes. Hitler's circle destroyed evidence of this mission, not a massacre, not a war crime file, a mission, an operation. Something that had been set in motion, and either completed or abandoned in total secrecy. The question that began haunting a small group of post-war investigators was simple but devastating. Why would a dying regime spend its final energy hiding something it had done, rather than something it had done wrong? That question opened a door, and behind that door was a story that the most powerful man in Nazi Germany had decided the world must never find. There is a particular kind of silence that is louder than any explosion. It is the silence of a secret that was almost perfectly buried. Almost. Because somewhere between the burning files, the hurried evacuations, and the desperate final days of a collapsing empire, one thread survived, and that thread pulled everything apart. It began not in Berlin, not in a grand war room surrounded by generals and maps, but in a small, unmarked office, tucked inside a building that officially housed nothing more than a mid-level administrative department of the Reich. No plaques on the wall, no uniforms visible from the street. No record of who entered or left. Post-war investigators would later describe this location as a room that existed only in the spaces between official records. The men selected for this mission were not typical soldiers. They were not decorated war heroes or frontline commanders. They were something far more dangerous. They were invisible men. Operatives chosen specifically because their names appeared nowhere near the upper ranks of the Reich's known power structure. This was intentional. Whoever designed this mission understood one critical thing. The moment a recognizable name attached itself to this operation, the secret would become fragile. So they chose men who, on paper, barely existed. Fragments recovered from partial Abwehr files. The Reich's own military intelligence service suggested the mission had a code name, but even that code name was itself a layer of deception. Intelligence analysts who later studied these fragments noted that the name pointed deliberately in the wrong direction, toward a false objective. A ghost trail designed to mislead anyone who stumbled too close. One senior Allied decoder working in post-war Munich described it bluntly. Whoever built this operation understood deception at a level that went beyond military training. This was architectural. It was designed from the very beginning to disappear. But what was the mission actually attempting to achieve? Here is where the fragments become deeply uncomfortable. Cross-referencing intercepted wartime signals, partial Swiss banking records from 1943 to 1945, and a collection of testimonies from post-war interrogations that were curiously classified for decades. A picture begins to emerge. The mission was not about winning the war. By late 1944, Hitler's inner circle already knew the war was lost. This mission was about something far more calculated, something that would outlast the Reich itself. It was about survival, not of one man, not of an army, but of an idea, a network, a continuation, a carefully constructed bridge between a dying empire and whatever would come next. Specific resources were being moved, not weapons, not soldiers, wealth, documents, people, certain individuals, scientists, strategists, men carrying knowledge of things that no post-war tribunal was ever meant to examine, were being quietly repositioned, like chess pieces, being moved off the board, before the board itself was set on fire. And at the very center of this movement was an authorization that traced back, through 3 layers of intermediaries, directly to Hitler himself. He knew he approved it. And then, when the walls finally came down, he ordered it destroyed. Not because it had failed, but perhaps because it had succeeded. And a successful secret, in the wrong hands, is the most dangerous thing in the world. There is something deeply revealing about what a man destroys. In the last moments he has left, not what he fights for, not what he builds, but what he burns. Because a man only burns what he is truly afraid of. It was April 1945. Berlin was not a city anymore. It was a graveyard that hadn't finished falling yet. Soviet artillery shook the ground every few minutes. The sky above the Reich Chancellery glowed a permanent, ugly orange. Entire city blocks had been reduced to dust and splinters. Rats moved through hallways where generals had once walked. And yet, in the middle of all that destruction, in the middle of a world literally collapsing from every direction, a small, quiet, organized group of men were not fighting. They were not evacuating wounded soldiers. They were not defending positions. They were collecting papers, moving through specific locations with specific lists, pulling specific files from specific drawers, and feeding them, one by one, into fires that had been deliberately lit for exactly this purpose. This was not panic. This was precision. Historians examining the final days at Rastenburg, Hitler's eastern headquarters, the infamous Wolf's Lair, noted something that still generates quiet debate in academic circles today. Certain sections of the facility were destroyed, with a level of thoroughness that far exceeded what military demolition required. Walls were not just blown apart, they were pulverized. Filing rooms were not just burned, the ash was scattered. One post-war forensic investigator wrote in a private report, later partially declassified in the 1990s. The destruction in these specific rooms was not the destruction of retreat, it was the destruction of intention. Someone wanted to make absolutely certain that reconstruction was impossible, but fire has limits, and human beings make mistakes. Even the most carefully planned erasure leaves traces. A courier who was supposed to burn a particular document pouch instead buried it in a field outside a small Polish village, intending to return for it later. He never returned. Decades later, a farmer's plow struck something metal in that field. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, remarkably preserved, was 17 pages, partial, fragmented, maddeningly incomplete, but enough. Enough to confirm that the mission had been real. Enough to show that it had moved resources across at least 4 neutral countries. And enough to reveal one name, a single name, that appeared on those pages, in a context that made post-war investigators go very, very quiet, because that name was not supposed to be anywhere near this operation. It was the name of someone who, after the war, had rebuilt their life in plain sight. Someone who had been interviewed by Allied intelligence. Someone who had been cleared. Meanwhile, on the other side of the collapsing world, Soviet intelligence units pushing into Berlin were finding their own strange silences. They had expected to capture mountains of Reich documentation, and in many places, they did, but in certain specific locations that seemed to correspond, roughly, to addresses that appeared in other captured files, they found nothing. Clean rooms, empty shelves, the faint chemical smell of accelerant, and in one location, boot prints in the ash. Fresh ones, meaning someone had been there after the burning. Someone had come back to check. Operation Paperclip, the American program that quietly absorbed Nazi scientists into post-war institutions, would later be scrutinized for what it officially imported. But investigators working on the fringes of this particular mystery began asking a different question entirely. What did Paperclip accidentally import, without knowing what it was carrying? Because some of the men who passed through that program had names that appeared, in very small ways, in very obscure places, connected to the mission that was never supposed to exist. The cover-up had been nearly perfect. Nearly. But the most dangerous thing about a secret that large is that it requires too many people to keep it. And people eventually talk. Every secret, no matter how deeply buried, has a heartbeat. And if you are patient enough, quiet enough, and brave enough to listen, you can hear it. By the early 2000s, a small, determined group of independent historians, archival researchers, and declassified intelligence analysts had been quietly assembling something extraordinary. Not a theory, not a speculation, a map, built from 17 recovered pages found in a Polish field, partial Swiss financial records that had survived a 1946 banking audit, 3 post-war interrogation transcripts that had been classified for over 50 years, and a collection of seemingly unrelated Soviet intelligence memos that, when placed side by side in the correct order, told a single, devastating story. The mission had a purpose that was breathtaking in its ambition. It was not simply about moving wealth or protecting scientists. Those were the mechanisms. The true objective was something far more calculated. Hitler's inner circle, or more precisely, a specific faction within that inner circle, had identified, as early as 1943, that Germany would eventually lose the conventional war. And so they began building something else entirely, a post-war infrastructure, hidden financial channels, flowing through neutral Switzerland and Argentina, safe passage networks disguised as humanitarian operations, academic and scientific placements inside Western institutions that would take decades to fully activate. And at the ideological center of all of it, a collection of documents, strategies, blueprints, not for weapons, for influence, long-term, patient, invisible influence, embedded inside the post-war world like a splinter beneath skin. One declassified CIA memo from 1953, released only in 2001, under a Freedom of Information request, referenced, in deliberately vague language, a network of ideological continuity originating from a destroyed Reich program that analysts believed was still functionally active in at least 3 Western European nations. 3 Western European nations. 8 years after the war had supposedly ended. Everything, and here is where the story becomes truly uncomfortable. Because the same CIA memo, the same document that acknowledged this network's existence, also recommended, in its final paragraph, that the matter be monitored but not aggressively pursued, due to what it described as the complexity of overlapping institutional relationships. In plain language, some of the people connected to this network were already too embedded, too useful, too deeply woven into the fabric of post-war Western power to touch. The mission that Hitler ordered destroyed was not destroyed because it failed. The evidence strongly suggests it was destroyed because it succeeded beyond what even its architects had initially imagined. And the destruction order itself was the final masterstroke of the entire operation. Because by burning the evidence, by silencing the operatives, by turning the mission into a ghost, they guaranteed that even if fragments surfaced, even if investigators got close, there would never be enough to build a complete case. The absence of proof was the proof. The 17 pages found in that Polish field were studied, authenticated, and then quietly transferred to a government archive in 2004. They have not been made fully available to the public. Requests to access the complete file have been acknowledged, but never fulfilled. So what does history tell us? When we finally step back and look at the full picture, it tells us that the most consequential battles in human history are not always fought on battlefields. Sometimes they are fought in quiet rooms, with ink, with fire, with silence. It tells us that the men who shape the future are not always the ones standing in the light. Sometimes they are the ones carefully controlling what the light is allowed to touch. And it tells us one final, deeply sobering thing: that a secret powerful enough to be ordered destroyed is a secret powerful enough to still be alive, somewhere out there, in an archive not yet opened, in a file not yet declassified, in a building whose address appears in no official record. The rest of this story is still waiting. The question is not whether the truth exists. The question is whether the world is ready to find it.